Blood stained the snowy forest floor, a stark contrast to the silver fur of a dying beast. Weakened by a brutal rejection that shattered her soul, she offered her last breath to save him. She thought she was trading her life for a stray. She was saving a king. Winter in the village of Oakhaven was always cruel, but this year, the frost seemed to bite directly into Isolde's bones. Oakhaven, the heart of the Silver Mist territory, was a medieval fortress of cobblestone and heavy timber, surrounded by ancient, towering pines. Smoke billowed from the hearths of the pack members, but there was no warmth for Isolde. Not anymore. She stood in the center of the muddy town square, the biting wind whipping her thin linen dress around her frail frame. Before her stood Caleb, the soon-to-be alpha of the Silver Mist. He was clad in rich furs and a dark leather tunic, looking every inch the lord he was destined to become. Beside him stood Beatrix. Tall, fierce, and adorned in a cloak lined with winter fox, Beatrix was the daughter of Lord Stirling, the wealthy baron who controlled the iron mines in the eastern valleys. Isolde was a healer. She was an orphan raised by the pack's apothecary, possessing a rare, quiet magic that could mend bone and soothe fever. But she possessed no land, no armies, and no iron. When the moon goddess paired her with Caleb 3 nights ago on their 18th name day, it was supposed to be a joyous occasion. Instead, it was a political disaster. Isolde, Caleb's voice rang out, devoid of the warmth they had shared as children. The entire pack stood in a wide circle around them. Alden, the blacksmith, Sybil the baker, and dozens of warriors, all watching with varying degrees of pity and cold indifference. The Silver Mist requires strength. We face encroaching rogues from the dead woods, and our armories are empty. Eluna must bring power, not just poultices. Isolde's voice trembled, but she kept her chin high. We are mates, Caleb. The goddess wove our souls together. You cannot undo what the moon has bound. Caleb's jaw tightened. Beatrix placed a possessive, territorial hand on his chest. I must do what is right for my people, he declared, his voice amplifying with his latent alpha command. He took a step back, locking his golden eyes with hers. I, Caleb of the Silver Mist, future alpha of this territory, officially reject you, Isolde, as my mate and Luna. The words were a physical blow. In the lore of their kind, a rejected bond was not just a broken heart, it was a severing of the soul. Isolde gasped as a sound like snapping timber echoed in her mind. Her inner wolf let out a blood-curdling, agonizing howl before collapsing into utter silence. Isolde fell to her knees in the freezing mud. She coughed, and a spray of dark blood stained the pristine snow. The pain was absolute, a jagged, burning, tearing in her chest that made it impossible to breathe. By the laws of our ancestors, Caleb continued, turning his back on her gasping form, you are stripped of your rank. You will vacate the inner village and reside in the abandoned hunting cabin on the fringes of the Whispering Woods. You are no longer under my protection. No one moved to help her. To touch a rejected mate was to challenge the Alpha's decree. For 3 days, Isolde dragged herself to the edge of the territory. The cabin was a dilapidated ruin of rotting wood and drafty stone. She had no firewood, no provisions, and her body was shutting down. A rejected wolf without a pack bond slowly perishes. Her hair lost its luster, turning brittle. Her skin grew dangerously pale, and her once vibrant green eyes became hollow. Her healing magic, usually a warm, pulsing river beneath her skin, was reduced to a stagnant, freezing puddle. Her soul was bleeding out, and she knew she only had a few days left to live. 5 days after the rejection, the hunger and the agonizing phantom pain in her chest drove Isolde into the Whispering Woods. The medieval locals believed the forest was cursed, filled with dark magic and ancient beasts, but Isolde no longer feared death. She welcomed it. She was merely looking for kingsfoil and deathcap mushrooms, a mixture that would put her to sleep peacefully, ending the torturous, slow decay of the severed bond. The forest was a labyrinth of twisted roots and snow-draped branches blocking out the pale winter sun. She trudged through knee-deep drifts, her breath misting in the freezing air, her bare, frost-bitten feet numb to the jagged ice. Then, she smelled it. The scent was overwhelming. It wasn't the fresh, earthy scent of the Silver Mist wolves. This was a suffocating aura of ozone, crushed pine, and an alpha command so ancient and terrifying it forced Isolde to her knees. But laced beneath that intoxicating scent was the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood and the sickening odor of silver poisoning. Driven by an instinct older than her grief, Isolde followed the scent. She crested a small, snow-covered ridge and looked down into a sunken stone, hollow the ruins of an old medieval watchtower. What she saw made her heart stutter. Scattered across the bloody snow were the bodies of 6 massive rogue wolves, and 2 humans dressed in the crimson chainmail of the Bloodfang mercenaries, elite assassins known throughout the kingdom. They were dead, torn apart with a savagery that spoke of a one-sided massacre. In the center of the carnage lay the victor, though he was barely clinging to life. It was a wolf of monstrous proportions, easily the size of a draft horse. His fur was midnight black, but the tips shimmered with a distinct, metallic silver sheen, a royal mutation whispered about in old tavern tales. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. A massive, silver-forged broadsword was driven deeply into his ribs, pinning him partially to the frozen earth. Black veins of silver toxicity were spreading rapidly from the wound across his abdomen. Isolde slid down the embankment, her healer's instincts briefly overriding her agonizing weakness. As she approached, the great beast let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground. His eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, molten gold, burning with a fierce, untamed authority, even as the light of life faded from them. "Easy," Isolde whispered, her voice raspy and frail. She dropped to her knees beside his massive head. Up close, the sheer size of him was terrifying. Yet she felt a strange, inexplicable pull to ease his suffering. She didn't know this was Alistair, the Alpha King of the Northern Ironclaw Pack, the most feared and powerful ruler in the realm, ambushed on a diplomatic journey. She only saw a beautiful, broken creature. "You're dying," she murmured, her freezing fingers gently brushing the uninjured side of his muzzle. The wolf flinched, but then, sensing her lack of malice, let his massive head rest in the snow, his golden eyes watching her with intense intelligence. Isolde looked at the silver sword. If left in, the poison would kill him in minutes. If removed, he would likely bleed out. Normal healing magic could not cure silver poisoning in a wound that deep. It required a pure transfer of life force. Isolde looked down at her own pale, trembling hands. Her life was over. Caleb had seen to that. The pack had abandoned her. She was going to die in this forest anyway. "Why not make my last breath mean something?" she thought. She gripped the hilt of the silver broadsword. The metal scorched her palms, burning her skin, but she gritted her teeth. With a feral scream, she used every ounce of her remaining physical strength and yanked the blade free. The beast roared in agony, black blood erupting from the wound. Isolde immediately slammed both of her bare, bleeding hands over the gaping hole in his ribs. She closed her eyes and reached deep into the core of her being, finding the last flickering embers of her soul. "Take it," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silent forest. She didn't cast a standard healing spell. She opened the floodgates of her own vitality. A blinding, ethereal white light exploded from her palms. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. She felt the lethal cold of the silver poison leaving the wolf and entering her own veins. She felt his torn muscles knitting together, fueled by the very beating of her own heart. The great wolf whined, a sound of confusion and resistance. He felt the pure, unadulterated sacrifice. He tried to nudge her away with his snout, not wanting a stranger to die for him, but Isolde held firm, locking her arms in place. "Live," she breathed, tears of blood leaking from the corners of her eyes as her life force drained away. The black veins on his stomach receded. The massive wound closed, leaving only a thick silver scar. In exchange, Isolde's vision went entirely dark. The phantom pain of her rejected mate bond was finally silenced, replaced by a cold, heavy nothingness. As her hand slipped from his fully healed side, she collapsed backward into the blood-stained snow. Her breathing stopped, and her world faded to black, her final thought a peaceful acceptance that she had done one last good thing. She didn't see the massive black wolf shift. She didn't feel the powerful, muscular arms of a human man scoop her lifeless body from the snow, nor did she hear the raw, commanding roar of a king echoing through the trees, vowing to the moon goddess that he would not let his savior die. The silence of the whispering woods was shattered by a guttural, earth-shaking roar. Alistair, the Alpha King of the Northern Ironclaws, shifted into his human form. He was a mountain of a man, heavily scarred from centuries of warfare, with hair the color of midnight and eyes that burned like liquid gold. The silver broadsword wound on his side was now merely a thick, pale scar, but the woman lying in the snow before him was completely devoid of life. He dropped to his knees, his massive hands trembling as he pulled Isolde's frail, freezing body against his chest. Her skin was like ice. Her heartbeat was utterly silent. Alistair pressed his ear to her chest. Panic, an emotion he had not felt since he was a pup, seizing his throat. As he touched her, he felt the magical residue of her sacrifice. But underneath the fading hum of her healing magic, he sensed something far more tragic. The hollow, jagged tear in her spiritual aura was unmistakable. A rejected mate, he realized, his chest tightening with fury. She was dying of a severed bond long before she took my poison. "You do not get to die for me, little wolf," Alistair commanded, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded the very air around them. "I am King Alistair of House Blackwood, and I do not accept this trade." Knowing that ordinary medicine would fail against a stopped heart and a severed soul, Alistair resorted to the oldest, most forbidden magic of his bloodline. The royal alpha blood carried potent regenerative properties, capable of forging bonds stronger than the moon's initial design, but it required absolute surrender. He lifted his wrist to his mouth and tore into his own flesh with his elongated canines. As his rich, dark blood welled to the surface, he pried Isolde's pale lips apart and pressed his bleeding wrist against her mouth. "Drink," he urged, forcing his life force into her throat. "Fight the darkness, come back to me." For a terrifying minute, nothing happened. The wind howled through the pines, mocking his desperate effort. Then, a violent shudder racked Isolde's body. She gasped, arching off the ground as the Alpha King's blood hit her stagnant veins like a lightning strike. She coughed, choking on the rich, metallic liquid, her chest heaving as her heart violently restarted. Alistair didn't waste a second. He wrapped her in his heavy, fur-lined royal cloak, scooped her into his arms, and began the grueling trek out of the cursed woods. He marched for 2 days and 2 nights without rest, guided by the scent of his northern outposts. When Isolde finally opened her eyes, she was no longer in the freezing mud or the rotting hunting cabin. She was lying in a massive 4-poster bed draped in crimson velvet and thick direwolf furs. The air smelled of roasting meats, pine needles, and the intoxicating, commanding scent of ozone and crushed pine. "You are awake." Isolde flinched, pulling the heavy furs to her chin. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair near a roaring hearth was the man from the forest. He was dressed in dark, finely spun wool and a leather tunic bearing a crest she recognized from old history books, the Silver Ironclaw. "You," Isolde stammered, her voice raspy but surprisingly strong. She touched her chest. The agonizing void left by Caleb's rejection was gone. In its place was a warm, pulsing, immovable anchor. "You are the beast, the dying wolf. And you are the healer who threw her life away for a stranger," Alistair replied, standing up. His presence filled the room, commanding yet strangely protective. "My name is Alistair, King of the Northern Territories." Isolde's breath hitched. She scrambled to kneel on the mattress, bowing her head. "Your Grace, I did not know." "Rise, Isolde of Oakhaven," he said gently, stepping forward to tilt her chin up with a calloused finger. "You owe me no bows. You gave me your life. In return, I gave you my blood." He traced the side of her neck. Where once there had been nothing, a faint, glowing silver mark in the shape of a wolf's paw was blooming on her skin. It was the mark of a king's mate. "When my blood mingled with your magic, the goddess recognized a debt that could only be paid with a soul tie," Alistair explained, his golden eyes blazing with fierce possession and profound reverence. "You are no longer a rejected stray. You are my second chance mate. And you are the Queen of the North." Isolde wept, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming realization that she was finally safe. Over the next 3 weeks, under the protection of the King's elite guard led by the formidable commander Arthur Pendleton, Isolde recovered completely. Her magical reserves didn't just return. They multiplied, fueled by the King's immense aura. Her brittle hair transformed into cascading waves of rich mahogany, and her hollow eyes regained their vibrant, emerald fire. But as she grew stronger, Alistair's intelligence network was hard at work. Commander Arthur brought news from the south that turned the King's gratitude into cold, calculating wrath. Winter's grip on the village of Oakhaven had tightened into a suffocating stranglehold. The weeks following Isolde's banishment had not brought the prosperity and security Alpha Caleb had promised his people. Instead, a heavy, cursed misfortune seemed to have settled over the Silver Mist Pack. The iron ore arriving from Lord Reginald Stirling's eastern valleys, the very wealth Caleb had traded his fated mate to secure, was brittle and fraught with impurities. Alden, the master blacksmith, had broken 3 anvils trying to forge weapons that inevitably shattered upon their first strike. To make matters worse, the rogue attacks on the southern borders had escalated from disorganized skirmishes into coordinated, brutal sieges. The pack was starving, freezing, and losing faith in their young, arrogant alpha. Caleb stood on the battlements of his stone keep, his hands gripping the freezing parapet. Beside him stood Beatrix. She was draped in exorbitant layers of imported sable, complaining bitterly about the draft in the great hall. Caleb rubbed his temples, a persistent dull ache throbbing where the bright, warm connection to his fated mate used to reside. He had convinced himself that the pain of the severed bond would fade. It hadn't. Every night, his inner wolf howled in a desolate, empty void, punishing him for his arrogance. Suddenly, the mournful, bone-rattling blast of the watchtower horn shattered the morning silence. It wasn't the short, sharp staccato warning of a rogue attack. It was a long, deep, resonant bellow that signaled the arrival of royalty. Caleb leaned over the stone edge, his breath catching in his throat. Marching down the snow-choked valley was an army of breathtaking discipline and terrifying scale. Hundreds of warriors clad in heavy, dark steel plate armor moved in perfect, rhythmic unison, the ground vibrating beneath their synchronized boots. Above them snapped massive banners of midnight silk, bearing the silver, imposing crest of the Northern Iron Claw. "The Alpha King," Caleb whispered, the color draining from his face. "King Alistair never brings his host this far south. Never." Beatrix's eyes gleamed with sudden, opportunistic greed. "This is our salvation, Caleb. If we can secure a military alliance with the North, the rogues will be crushed, and my father's trade routes will be secure. We must receive them with full honors." Caleb swallowed the lump of dread in his throat. He ordered the massive oak gates of the village opened and assembled the remaining able-bodied members of the Silver Mist Pack in the muddy town square. Sybil the baker, Alden the smith, and dozens of exhausted, shivering wolves gathered, watching with wide, fearful eyes as the northern vanguard breached their walls. At the center of the imposing formation rode King Alistair. He was mounted on a monstrous black warhorse, looking like a god of war carved from granite and shadow. The sheer weight of his alpha aura rolled over the village like a physical tidal wave. It was an ancient, suffocating power. Half of the Silver Mist Pack, overwhelmed by the primal instinct to submit, immediately dropped to their knees in the frozen mud. Caleb forced himself to remain standing, though his knees trembled violently. He stepped forward, pasting on a diplomatic smile, and bowed deeply from the waist. "King Alistair of the Iron Claw, the Silver Mist Pack is profoundly honored by your royal presence. We welcome you to Oakhaven." Alistair brought his warhorse to a halt. He did not dismount immediately, nor did he return the greeting. His molten gold eyes swept over the impoverished, freezing village, lingering with profound disgust on Caleb and the heavily jeweled Beatrix. "I have not come to exchange pleasantries, boy." Alistair's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that echoed off the stone walls and vibrated in the chests of everyone present. "I have come to purge a rot that has festered on my southern borders. And I have come to introduce you to your new queen." Caleb blinked in confusion. The Alpha King had been without a mate for decades. It was a well-known fact across the realms. Alistair swung down from his massive horse, his boots hitting the cobblestone with a heavy, authoritative thud. He turned toward an opulent, heavily armored carriage positioned in the center of the vanguard. Stepping forward, the imposing monarch removed his thick leather glove and gently offered his bare hand to the carriage door. The door opened. A slender, pale hand, adorned with a single ring of northern sapphire, rested in the king's massive palm. As the woman stepped out of the carriage, a collective stunned gasp ripped through the Oakhaven pack. It was Isolde, but she was no longer the frail, shivering apothecary they had abandoned to the winter. She was breathtaking, a vision of absolute, undeniable power. Clad in a tailored, sweeping gown of midnight blue silk that rivaled the night sky, she wore a heavy cloak of pure white winter fox draped elegantly over her shoulders. A delicate, masterfully forged crown of silver and sapphire rested on her cascading mahogany hair. Her emerald eyes, once hollow with impending death, now burned with the vibrant, fierce fire of a Luna. But it was her aura that truly brought Caleb to his knees. It was immense, warm, and distinctly intertwined with the terrifying power of the Alpha King. On the side of her neck, glowing faintly in the overcast daylight, was the silver, scarred mark of a royal mate bond. "Isolde?" Caleb choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. He fell to the mud, his hands clutching his chest as his inner wolf violently thrashed against his ribs, recognizing the devastating magnitude of what he had thrown away. No, that's impossible. You were severed. You were dead. I felt the bond snap. Beatrix sneered, her face contorting with ugly jealousy, though her hands shook uncontrollably. What is the meaning of this? You parade a rejected, useless Omega before us and call her a queen? Is this a northern joke, your grace? The crack of a gauntleted backhand echoed like a gunshot through the square. Commander Arthur Pendleton, the legendary Sword of the North, stood towering over Beatrix, his broadsword already half drawn from its scabbard. Beatrix sprawled in the mud, spitting blood. You will address the Queen of the North with your face in the dirt. Whelp! Arthur snarled, his eyes flashing dangerously. Speak out of turn again, and I will take your tongue as a trophy. Alistair stepped forward, placing himself protectively between his queen and her former tormentors. She is no joke, the king stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. She is the savior of my life. She gave her last breath to pull silver poison from my veins, expecting nothing but death in return. The moon goddess recognized her unparalleled sacrifice, and my blood recognized her soul. She bears my mark, and she holds my heart. But that is not why my army surrounds your walls today. Alistair raised a hand. The ranks of the Ironclaw warriors parted. Two massive guards dragged 3 figures forward and threw them violently into the mud at Caleb's feet. 2 of the men were dressed in the torn, blood-stained crimson chainmail of the Bloodfang mercenaries, specifically a notorious assassin named Silas, known for hunting wolves with silver-laced weaponry. But it was the third man that made Beatrix scream in absolute horror. It was Lord Reginald Sterling. The wealthy, untouchable baron of the Eastern Valleys was stripped of his finery, battered, bruised, and bound in heavy iron chains. "Father!" Beatrix shrieked, crawling toward him, but a sharp look from Commander Arthur froze her in place. Caleb stared at the bound lord, his mind fracturing. "Lord Sterling? What? I don't understand. What is he doing in chains?" "He is awaiting execution for high treason against the Northern Crown," Isolde spoke. Her voice was steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of the timidness she once possessed. She stepped to her husband's side, looking down at the man who had ordered her into exile. "You wanted strength, Caleb. You wanted a Luna with armies and iron, so you aligned yourself with Lord Sterling, but you were too blind to see you were merely a pawn on his chessboard." Isolde gestured to the battered mercenaries. "The rogues attacking your borders, the sudden influx of silver weaponry in the south, it was all funded by Reginald Sterling. He orchestrated the attacks on his own daughter's pack to make you desperate, to make you rely entirely on his wealth and his military aid." Alistair produced a heavy, leather-bound ledger from his cloak and tossed it onto the cobblestones. It landed with a heavy smack next to Caleb's trembling hands. "Your father-in-law hired the Bloodfang to ambush my diplomatic envoy in the Whispering Woods," Alistair continued, his aura flaring so brightly that the ground began to crack beneath his boots. "He intended to assassinate me, blame it on the southern rogues, and use the resulting chaos to annex the Silver Mist territory and march on the north. He almost succeeded. Had Isolde not found me, I would be dead, and your pack would already be enslaved in his mines." Caleb stared at the ledger. He recognized Lord Sterling's seal. He recognized the lists of payments made to the mercenaries. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had traded his destined, true mate, a woman of profound magic and unparalleled bravery, for the daughter of a traitor who had been actively orchestrating his downfall. He had sacrificed his soul for worthless, brittle iron. "No," Caleb whispered, tears of profound, agonizing regret spilling hot tracks down his freezing cheeks. "No, I didn't know. I swear to the goddess, I didn't know. Ignorance is not a defense for an alpha," Alistair declared coldly. "You are blind to treason within your own ranks. You are cruel to your own blood. You abandon the weak and grovel to the deceitful. By the ancient laws of the ancestors, you are unfit to lead." Alistair drew his massive, silver-forged broadsword, the metal singing a deadly note in the crisp air. He pointed the tip directly at Caleb's throat. "I, King Alistair of House Blackwood, hereby strip you, Caleb of Oakhaven, of your alpha title and your lands. The Silver Mist territory is hereby annexed by the Northern Crown. Your warriors will integrate into my vanguard, or they will be exiled. Your traitorous father-in-law will hang before sunset." Caleb didn't fight back. The fight had completely drained out of him. He looked up past the deadly blade, his desperate eyes locking onto Isolde, Isolde, please. I was wrong. I was so arrogant. He choked on a sob. I loved you. Isolde looked down at the ruined, pathetic boy in the mud. She felt no anger, no vindictiveness. She only felt a profound, distant pity. You didn't love me, Caleb, Isolde said softly, her words carrying clearly across the silent, breathless square. You loved the idea of power. You told me Eluna must bring strength to her people. You just couldn't recognize true strength until a real king showed it to you. She turned her back on him, the heavy winter fox cloak swirling elegantly around her ankles. She slipped her hand into Alistair's massive, waiting grip. The king sheathed his sword, his golden eyes filled with an all-consuming adoration as he looked at his mate. He led his queen back to their carriage, leaving the broken boy in the mud to watch the true rulers of the realm ascend. As the carriage doors closed and the northern army moved to secure the keep, the silver mist that had long plagued the valley finally began to clear, making way for the iron rain of the north. Isolde's journey from a discarded, broken healer to the revered Queen of the North proves that true strength lies in selfless sacrifice. Caleb sought power through political gain and lost everything, while Isolde gave her last breath for a stranger and gained the world. Sometimes, the most devastating rejections are merely the universe clearing the path for our true destiny to unfold.